I'm great. How are you?
I am super good. This is Sunny. How's it going?
It's going fantastic now that you're here. I'm so excited to have you for this conversation. Thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I love your background. The purple is just, so vibrant, beautiful.
We thought we'd give Regal today. So,
Regal.
always purple. Well, as I was telling the folks before you got here, this is Black Women Are the Blueprint. And I say that because I truly believe Black women are the blueprint.
I,
We set the tone. We are courageous. We fill up space. We go where others don't. And I'm so excited to spend this whole month just speaking with Black women leaders like yourself about the work that you're doing.
yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Now, when did you first become passionate about solutions for our planet's problems?
That's a good question. I feel like I love that this is called Black Women Are the Blueprint because I think that Black and Indigenous folks are the blueprint for sustainability. So I
Absolutely.
feel like a lot of my cultural practices kind of had to do with sustainability. So reusing and recycling and different things like that. I feel like it's something that my grandma taught me, just like it's some of our practices. And then it wasn't until I formally studied environmental science and policy that I started seeing, like, oh, this is actually a field of study. And the way that my, grandma has a beautiful garden in the backyard. Okay, gardening can actually be like a solution to the climate crisis and help, sequester carbon and things like that. So I feel like I've always been passionate about the environment, but didn't know I was an environmentalist until I formally started studying it. But yeah, so kind of a roundabout way, always have cared about it, then realized it was a field of study and was like, yeah, this totally makes sense for me.
I love that that was an early connection for you and your grandmother. When did that passion for sustainability turn into a passion for environmental justice?
I would say so. I'm born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and I grew up in a small town called Florissant, Missouri. My parents still live there right now. And for folks who aren't familiar, there's kind of Florissant, and then there's Ferguson, Florissant, and Ferguson, which are all neighborhoods that are about 15 minutes apart from each other. So when I started studying environmental science, it was actually at the time of the Ferguson uprisings that were happening kind of in my backyard and in my community. So, kind of the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement, or when we started seeing that hashtag happening a little bit more on Twitter. So, I really wanted to see if there were ways that I could apply what I was learning in these environmental solutions in my classes to racial injustice and the social unrest that was happening back home. And that's where I found that intersection between social justice and environmental issues called environmental justice. And I really just went down a rabbit hole and learned everything I could about environmental justice history. Not surprisingly, race is the number one indicator of where toxic waste sites and facilities might be found, and several other environmental injustices as well as income. And I felt like it wasn't talked about enough, and I wanted to do everything I could to really raise awareness using social media and other forms of media.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I also want to take a moment because I knew you were a Midwest girl. I knew you were from St. Louis. I'm from Chicago, and I actually went to Mizzou, so I know all about that Missouri life.
Okay.
I know the connections are just. But I had to take a moment. I couldn't move on. Now, when you're speaking about environmental justice and everything that you've learned, how do you explain that concept for people who don't get it, who have never heard of it before?
I would say that environmental justice impacts pretty much everyone, whether you're talking about kind of white rural communities that are mountain towns and might have fracking fluid, or we're talking about, previous places where there was a coal industry and there's like air pollution or different things like that because of that industry. And then some communities also struggle with, like a lot of urban areas, struggle with a lack of tree coverage and increased air pollution, etc. So I would say that, I think oftentimes we forget that we're a part of this great big ecosystem. And we think that our cities and suburbs and things like that are kind of separate from nature, and that nature is something that we go into, like a national park. And to get to environmental justice, it's important to realize no, our communities, our cities, our suburbs are a part of nature. So those environmental issues that are happening in our own communities, those are environmental injustices. So yeah, it really varies from, city to city, whatever the issue might be, whether it's water pollution, air pollution, lack of food, fracking fluid, etc. But I would say it's that intersection between social and environmental issues.
Yeah. It's so interesting to think about all the different ways that environmental justice and environmental injustices show up in our life. Like, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, I live in Brooklyn now, and you don't think about what neighborhoods have more trees than others because all of a sudden shade becomes a privilege along your street, and what greenery is upkept better in maybe more affluent neighborhoods. How do you speak to people who might not see environmental justice showing up in their everyday lives or environmental injustice showing up in their everyday lives, that this is important, that this is something that they should care about too?
Yeah, it's so important because I think most people could agree that everyone should have access to basic human environmental needs. So that's like clean air and water. So that's kind of the minimum, and that's where I'm starting. And unfortunately, even in the United States and so many countries around the world, but specifically talking about the US, where I focus most of my work, that isn't the case. So if we're looking at places like Flint, Michigan, or folks that have lead in their water, or again, if we're talking about rural mountain towns in the United States that have, fracking fluid in their water, that isn't having access to those basic human needs. And if you don't have clean air to breathe or clean water to drink, yes, you can still be happy and experience joy, but it's a lot harder if you're not having those basic human needs met. So that's why it's just so important. And I want to ground people in, yeah, there's a lot more complicated environmental justice issues like toxic waste sites and facilities. But the basic thread is just making sure people have clean air, clean water, and that their environment is not actively poisoning them, which is something that unfortunately is happening everywhere. And I also want to raise awareness for what's going on right now, I believe in Ohio. And I think it's pronounced Palestine, Ohio. There was a train derailment that just happened, and there was toxic waste that was put into a lot of the waterways. So that's a current ongoing issue that's happening right now. That's an EJ issue.
Thank you so much for raising that issue for our audience. And for anyone who's just joining us, this is Leah Thomas, and my name is Luria Freeman. And this is Black Women Are the Blueprint. In honor of Women's History Month, we're having a conversation with various Black women leaders. Today, we're talking to Leah as an environmental justice advocate, and she is sharing her work with us and sharing why you should care about the environmental injustices that are happening in your neighborhood. And we've talked a little bit about examples of what environmental injustices look like. Obviously, I'm not saying that like shade on my trees are impacting my quality of life on a day-to-day basis. But if you really want to hear about some real examples, don't talk to me, talk to Leah. Go to Intersectional Environmentalist, which is her nonprofit. She has so many educational resources there for people who want to inform themselves, educate themselves about what's really happening, not only across this country, but around the world. Now, Leah, last year you published a book titled The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and the Planet. Were you surprised by anything that you learned while writing that book?
I would say that, again, environmental injustice impacts every community very differently. And I have a couple breakdowns. So there's a chapter on the AAPI experience, so Asian American Pacific Islanders and environmental injustice in the United States. And even finding out specifically in Los Angeles, the Pacific Islander community is surrounded by like the most toxic waste. That's not something that I had learned about before, or specifically looking at how like Chinese Americans and Korean Americans are impacted by environmental injustice. And then also doing breakdowns with, indigenous communities in the United States and the specific issues that they're facing, et cetera. And just seeing that it's a really big issue for so many communities. And I think a lot of people just aren't aware of it. But I know like living in St. Louis, sometimes when I would drive over one highway, I'd like hold my nose because it had a funny smell. But it wasn't until later that I realized, oh, it's because there's toxic waste and landfills that are surrounding this area. And that's actually leading to issues with, water quality and air quality, etc. So I would just encourage people to understand that environmental injustice is happening all around us. And there's a lot of things that we kind of take for granted or don't even think about, like our air quality and water quality. But that's impacting a lot of folks. And a good place for people to start is even to check the air quality in their neighborhood because they might find it's not, as great as they might think it is. And, we can take local and state action to change some of those things. So, yeah, I really enjoyed writing the book and uncovering a lot of stories of solutions because, I think in an introduction to environmental injustice, it is important to talk about the injustices that are happening to different communities. But what really made me excited was finding out there's so many grassroots organizations that have the solutions to these issues, and they just need amplification and support and funding. So that's what made me like really happy when I finished the book that yes, there's all these issues, but we have all the power to change it.
That's a really good point that there are so many problems and that can feel overwhelming, but there are also a lot of people really passionate and committed to doing this work like yourself. So it's good to lean into like the solutions that just need a little more support. And as I'm walking through my questions here, I want to remind you all that you're going to be able to ask Leah questions. We have one of our producers, Michelle. She is looking at the chat right now, so behave. And she's pulling the best questions for our Q&A section at the end of this interview. So leave questions for Leah. Take advantage of this time and her expertise. Now, Leah, what are some hurdles that you've had to overcome as a young Black woman environmentalist?
I would say some hurdles that I've had to overcome was there's just a lot of people that don't want to. As a science person, it's really difficult because it's in the data. Like the Environmental Protection Agency can say race and income are the number one and two indicators of whether or not people will experience environmental injustice. And it's not just for environmental injustice, it's also about, education quality, criminal justice reform, etc. Race and income have a lot to do with who's experiencing those outcomes. But there are a lot of people who just don't want to believe that racism exists. They think it's a personal problem, something that you should just get over. And there's a lot of environmentalists who have spent their careers specifically focusing on the protection of animals and conservation, and they don't have empathy for Black and brown folks and feel like it shouldn't be included in their work. And that can get really dehumanizing at times to say, okay, this is a world-renowned environmental organization and you want to make sure that you protect the whales, but when it comes to Black and brown folks, we're not even a consideration. And I find that to be really odd, especially because the world's indigenous peoples, including Black indigenous peoples, protect over 80% of the world's biodiversity, but are only 5% of the population. So it is really important to talk about the protections of Black and brown folks and indigenous peoples, etc. But it can feel, really dehumanizing at times showing up in environmental spaces as a Black woman, trying to advocate for things as simple as our right to breathe clean air, which it doesn't feel like that's controversial at all. And then it gets controversial. But I know civil rights activists have struggled with the same thing for decades, wanting to just say, hey, we deserve equal rights, and then getting so much pushback. So sometimes there's, a similarity in the environmental space for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely, you're already fighting against people trying to show them the solutions that are possible, show them ways that they can be impacting their planet in healthy ways. But also within that community, I'm sure there is a hierarchy, I'm sure there's politics. Are there any spaces within environmental justice, within environmentalism, that you feel your experiences and your expertise are challenged the most as a young Black woman? I could already see you coming in just as a young person and people being like, what do you know?
Yeah. That does happen sometimes, but I think when I like pop out the facts,
Mm-hmm.
degree in environmental science, you're But even if I didn't have a degree, like the people who are experiencing environmental injustice and turn on their tap water and it's yellow in Flint,
Mhm.
Michigan, they are experts in environmental injustice. And about 70% of African Americans live in counties that frequently violate federal air quality standards, which is leading to an increase in asthma and respiratory illness in the Black community. So that is a lived experience of 70% of Black folks who I would say are experts in environmental injustice
Yeah.
because, a lot of folks have asthma, etc. So honestly, I've heard it all. I think sometimes when people push back and they're like, well, the planet's not racist, I'm like, okay, I'm just not going to engage in this
Yeah.
conversation. I just want to make sure people have clean air and clean water. And if you can't get behind that, uh, I don't need to be talking to you.
Yeah.
It's just so basic.
I've
Sometimes
never been one to really lean into people determined to misunderstand you. It's like, you know what I meant, you know?
you know that I don't think trees are actively oppressing people, but I think that oppressed people need more trees because
Hmm.
us breathe. And I'm just like, I don't even bother sometimes with the chaos.
Yeah. You have such a good attitude. You seem really focused on the work that you're doing. Is that what helps you rise above some detractors?
Absolutely. And I really try to think about the generations of Black women that came before me. And,
Yeah.
um, when my great grandmother is still alive and, they were able to go through much worse than I probably had. And people who, I just try to tell people that the future is usually a better indicator than the present of what's
Mhm.
morally right and wrong. Because I know in my heart of hearts that there's no way that wanting people to have clean air and water and access to a healthy living environment is controversial, just like how my ancestors knew that our right to vote was something that should be a right and our right
Yeah.
to, like in segregation or whatever the fights that my ancestors have gone through. So I try to just hold that in my heart that it's okay if there are some people in the present who don't get it. I know in my heart of hearts that I think what I'm asking for and what other environmental justice advocates are asking for is it's the way to go. So I feel confident in that, and that gets me through so many things.
Yeah. When you meet other young Black women who want to break into environmentalism, who want to walk alongside you and do this work, what is usually your advice for them?
I would say that even if your community isn't in your classroom or your organization, know that we're out there. And there's a beautiful history of Black resistance and resiliency within the environmental movement. I have an article I wrote for Vogue last year that's called All My Environmental Heroes Are Black Women. So even if you're not seeing them in your textbooks, know that they're out there and there are people who look like you. So don't feel alone. I know sometimes I felt that when I was in, predominantly white environmental organizations, but your community's there. If you can't find them in person, find us online. There's orgs like Black Girl Environmentalists that was started by a lovely activist named Wawa, Sustainable Brooklyn. I could go on and on and on. Like, just know we are out there and
Yes.
we got your back.
I love it. Oh my God. For anyone who's just joining this conversation, my name is Luria Freeman. I'm a correspondent for NowThis. This is Leah Thomas, also Green Girl Leah. She's an environmental justice advocate. And we've been having a really wonderful conversation about environmental justice and environmental injustices that happen not only across this country, but across the world, and how you can have an impact. Now, Leah, you were just talking about the importance of community and finding your people in environmentalism. Have you met any of the women that you really look up to that inspire you? And could you name some of those women?
Yeah, so I met a woman named Betty Reed Soskin, and we filmed a little mini documentary together. She's a 100-year-old Black park ranger who became a park ranger at like 85,
Wow.
just has this beautiful history. And it was so great having that intergenerational conversation and just learning about her experiences being like park rangers, like Black park rangers. So she is so cool. And then there's also Teresa Baker, who I met while I was working at Patagonia. and she started an organization called so there's the Outdoorist Oath that she founded with a couple friends of mine, and a project called the Outdoor Equity no, CEO Pledge, basically getting a bunch of companies in the outdoor industry to commit to diversity and inclusion. And then there's also Gloria Walton, who wrote the foreword of my book. She's in charge of the Solutions Project, which is a really amazing climate justice organization. And can you hear me okay? Someone said they can't.
Yeah.
Okay,
I,
cool.
you had went out a little bit ago. I think you were like pushing out a notification, but we
Okay.
can pause it.
Bye. Uh, and then also, yeah, Gloria Walton of the Solutions Project is just so cool.
Yeah. Look at you just dropping names on names on names. She told you they were out here. How does it feel to be in community with these women, to know that they exist and that they support you and that you support each other?
Yeah, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I can show up in any space and know that, there are people who have my back. This used to be like a popular TikTok audio, but it's like the girls that get it, and the girls that don't. So I just know like some people will get it, some people won't. Sometimes there might be even folks in your own community, but not all, skin folks are kin folks all the time. But just know it makes me feel good. It makes me feel empowered. And I also look to my community as an act of accountability too, because I know if I ever am, stepping out of line or could have said something better, that they are there, they have my back, whether it's to praise what I'm doing, to critique it, or provide suggestions. And I feel like that's kind of true community.
Yeah, that accountability piece is so important. Helping your sisters adjust their crowns without busting them out is an art that I need more people to lean into. I love it. Now, my last question for Leah is the way that the communities in the US are organized, the land that people live on, the resources available to them are all wrapped up in systemic racism. We've been saying that throughout this conversation. What is your advice for young Black people who feel like these problems are so big, but their voices are too small to make an impact?
Never too small. And I also tell people to systemic racism is such a big thing. And that's why I found a niche, which is also still a big thing, which is, environmentalism and racism. But I would encourage people to maybe find like a niche within that, whether it's like, okay, art and activism, because you just happen to be a really good artist and you want to apply that to activism, or, journalism can be a form of activism or whatever it is. So I would tell people start with like what you're naturally good at. For me, I love writing. So that's why writing is my form of activism and content creation. Even if you're just really good at math, nonprofits need help with accounting. Like a lot of us are struggling. So like find what you're really good at and apply that to the movements that you care about, because then you just genuinely get to show up as yourself. And that feels really good. And to understand that, yes, there might be people with large platforms on social media, but that doesn't mean that we are the hardest workers out there. And I would say most environmental justice leaders are right there in your community and they're doing incredible work every day. So to remember that a large platform doesn't mean that they're any better of an activist or whatever it is. And to know that every little piece of activism that you're doing contributes to the bigger whole. So to keep going.
Yeah, showing up with whatever talents you have is such great advice across fields, I feel like. Because some of us writing folk cannot do the math. So please bring the numbers if you know how to do it. Please. Now, Leah, like I said, we've had someone watching the comments, pulling the best questions from the people who have been viewing this conversation. And I have a few questions for you.
Yeah.
Now, someone asked a question that I hope you know the answer to. It says, what does sequester carbon mean? Okay. Someone was deep. We're in the trenches and they want to know.
Okay. Yeah, I love when people ask these questions because it reminds me like I am an environmental science nerd. So carbon sequestration essentially is just, how plants breathe. They do like the reverse of what we do. Trees are breathing, and that's basically what carbon sequestration is. So a lot of, let's see, what's it called? Okay, so when we're emitting a lot of pollution into the air and there's carbon, thankfully, trees breathe in carbon, unlike us, because we breathe in oxygen, and they will breathe in that carbon and purify it and exhale this beautiful, oxygen for us to breathe and to help purify our atmosphere. So that's why trees are just so amazing and like a kind of natural climate crisis fix because they literally breathe in all of that carbon and greenhouse gases and stuff like that. So the soil also does a similar thing. So that's why something called regenerative organic agriculture can be a natural solution for the climate crisis because our soils can also sequester carbon or breathe it in and purify it for us.
That's amazing. Shout out to the trees. Thank you, trees.
Yeah.
Plant a tree, please, everyone.
Plant it makes the difference. It really does. Like if everyone planted a tree, there would be like our air would just be so much cleaner.
Oh, God, I love that. I love natural solutions. I love just taking advantage of the world around us. And it wants to help us. It wants to help us.
Yes, it really does.
The next question is, are there pieces of legislation being proposed or drafted that would help solve these problems? I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, so we actually are having groundbreaking environmental justice legislation for the first time ever. There's some really great environmental justice legislation in the 80s, but right now we have $100 million in grants specifically for environmental justice. Shout out to Michael S. Regan, who is a Black head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And with them, we have $100 million in grants for environmental justice organizations. There's also an intergenerational council on environmental justice at the White House right now, which is so cool. So we're seeing really significant legislation that's focusing on environmental justice. The White House made like an IG Live last year that was titled Intersectionality in the Climate Crisis. And that's when I was like, okay, it's reaching places. So I think we're kind of in an Earth Day 2.0 right now. And then this is the time for an environmental justice renaissance. So I would tell people that there's going to be even more legislation that's coming. I think communities around the country are realizing how it's impacting them from the mountain towns, shout out to them, to all the way down in Louisiana to California. I think everyone's realizing that this is an issue that's impacting us and we want everyone to have those basic human environmental rights. So really good time for EJ.
That's so powerful. And like, this isn't a election year, but that doesn't mean that you can't stay plugged in. You can't stay locked in. Reach out to your local leaders, reach out to your local legislators, let them know what you care about, because that's where you make change on the local level. Keep applying pressure. It might not be an election year, but your voice does not stop mattering when it's not, you know?
Absolutely.
Our next question is, where in our own community should we look to find where policy is considered? In the cities?
I would say what I would do as a first start is Google your hometown or wherever you're based and say like insert city environmental justice organization. Because there's probably organizations that are there, even if they only have like 2 people, and they will tell you exactly what's going on. They'll just give you a whole rundown about, did you know there was a toxic waste site over here, this, that, and the other. So the first step is just to get knowledgeable of what's happening super locally. Because even, moving to Los Angeles from Santa Barbara before this and St. Louis, the issues are so different city to city. Like it might suddenly be, okay, well, this area has good water, but we don't have enough like trees, or this area has, highway pollution, but this area has like, I don't know, food injustice where there's too many fast food restaurants and not enough like organic produce. So really trying to figure out locally within like a couple mile radius what's going on in your hometown, I think is like a great place to start, and just do that quick environmental justice org, insert city.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is Black Women Are the Blueprint. This is Women's History Month. But Leah, if we're talking to allies watching this conversation, what can they do to help amplify the voices of Black women, of women everywhere working in environmentalism, people working to create solutions for this planet? How can they amplify those voices without kind of obstructing them?
I would say Just to listen and also just share. I mean, I find out a lot on my Instagram stories, and I don't like always tell my friends, like, oh, I saw this on your story. So I read this article and that taught me about this issue. And I feel like we should start doing that because maybe that would incentivize people to know, like, oh my God, what I'm sharing actually is making a difference.
Yeah.
But even just starting out with sharing on social media is really important. Also showing up if you can, and showing up to listen, not kind of dictate what's going on because a lot of communities, we are the bearers of our own solutions, but we just need amplification and support and resources. So volunteering, donating if you can, raising awareness about the fact that environmental justice organizations receive less than like 10% of philanthropic funding. So, really helping to close that funding gap so environmental justice solutions can scale.
Leah, you have been absolutely amazing. I learned so much during this conversation, and I hope our audience did too. I really appreciate you sharing your wealth of knowledge with us, giving us your expertise. I'm about to go plant a tree. I'm ready to get some good carbon sequestration
Yeah.
happening. All the little things. Uh, this has been Black Women Are the Blueprint on Now This. And we're going to be doing this every week in the month of March. Next week, we're talking to Brittany Pepnick Cunningham. At the end of the month, we're going to be talking to Angelica Ross from Pose. I know you watched Pose. So make sure you tune in every week to see what we're talking about. And please give it up for Leah. Thank her in the comments, please.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Thank you.